In the scorching deserts of ancient Mesopotamia, one of the most powerful men in Rome met a death so brutal, so grotesque, that it would echo through history, haunting the empire for generations. Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's wealthiest citizen, built an empire of gold on the backs of the poor and the enslaved. But in the end, that very gold would become the instrument of his destruction. This is the twisted story of how the thing that made him powerful, his wealth, became the thing that killed him. The year was 53 BCE. Rome's thirst for conquest had reached a boiling point. The Republic was effectively under the control of three men, an uneasy alliance of titans: Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus. Pompey was a brilliant general who commanded the Mediterranean. Caesar, meanwhile, was making headlines conquering Gaul. And Crassus? He had money, a lot of it. But he had no battlefield glory to his name, and that gnawed at him. See, while Caesar and Pompey were carving their names into history through conquest and military brilliance, Crassus was seen as a financier, a banker. His influence came not from victories or strategic genius, but from property deals and slave labor. In a world where glory was earned with the sword, Crassus was seen as the odd man out, the third wheel of the triumvirate. He hated that. Most men at 60 would be ready to retire into luxury, to enjoy their wealth in the villas and gardens of Rome. But Crassus couldn't stand being overshadowed. He wanted the kind of fame Caesar and Pompey had, the kind etched into marble, remembered by future generations. And he knew exactly how he was going to get it: military conquest. His eyes turned east, to Parthia. The Parthian Empire was a massive power stretching from the Euphrates River all the way to the Indus Valley. It controlled the silk and spice trade routes, making it a tantalizing prize both for its strategic value and unimaginable wealth. Crassus convinced himself that conquering Parthia would bring him both the glory he craved and enough riches to make even his fortune seem modest. There was just one problem. The Senate didn't authorize the war. They were suspicious of his ambitions, but Crassus wasn't interested in permission. He moved forward anyway. In 55 BCE, Crassus arrived in Syria as governor and immediately began preparing for war. Local commanders warned him not to underestimate the Parthians. They knew the kind of warfare practiced in the deserts: fast, mobile, and devastating to armies that weren't ready for it. But Crassus dismissed them. To him, the Parthians were just another Eastern kingdom that would crumble under Roman discipline and engineering. And why wouldn't he be confident? He had reports suggesting political instability inside the Parthian court. Their king, Orodes II, was supposedly dealing with internal rebellions. Crassus saw an opportunity for a quick and decisive strike. He pulled together a massive army, 7 Roman legions, nearly 40,000 men, plus 4,000 cavalry and 4,000 light infantry. It was one of the largest forces Rome had ever sent east. His own son, Publius, a seasoned fighter who had served with distinction under Caesar in Gaul, joined him as a commander. Crassus wasn't just chasing glory now. He was trying to build a legacy. The invasion kicked off in the spring of 53 BCE. Roman forces crossed the Euphrates at a city called Zeugma. The early days of the campaign went smoothly. Settlements along the way surrendered quickly, and Roman siege tactics worked like a charm. The flat, dry terrain seemed perfect for Rome's heavy infantry formations. Everything was going to plan. It even looked like King Orodes might be too distracted by his internal troubles to mount a defense. But it was all a trap. Unbeknownst to Crassus, the Parthians had a plan, and a brilliant young general named Surena was executing it to perfection. Rather than meeting the Romans head-on, Surena was pulling them deeper and deeper into the desert. He gave up ground deliberately, avoiding major battles and allowing small skirmishes that always ended with Parthian retreats. Crassus thought he was winning. In reality, he was being lured into the worst possible battlefield for a Roman army. Open, featureless desert. The Romans had been trained to fight in forests, cities, and tight formations. In Mesopotamia, the heat was unbearable, the distances long, and the enemy never seemed to stand still. Surena's forces were built entirely around mobility. The core of his army consisted of two types of cavalry: heavily armored shock troops called cataphracts, and highly mobile horse archers who could rain arrows from afar while staying out of reach. The Romans, expecting a classic engagement, couldn't adapt. They were used to set-piece battles. The Parthians didn't play that game. They preferred to harass and exhaust their enemies. Roman supply lines stretched thinner and thinner. Food and water were harder to come by. Their enemies seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. Scouts reported seeing strange shapes on ridges and dunes. Then nothing. Convoys would be ambushed without warning. Nights were filled with unsettling noises, keeping soldiers awake and terrified. Crassus's dream of a swift conquest was unraveling. It all came to a head near the town of CHRONICLES. Crassus decided to make a stand there, believing the geography gave him the advantage. The surrounding hills offered some defensive positions, and nearby water meant his army wouldn't dehydrate. Reports said Surena's main force was approaching. Crassus thought this would be the grand showdown he'd been waiting for, the battle that would make him a legend. On the morning of June 9th, 53 BCE, the Battle of Carrhae began. The Roman army deployed in classic formation: legionaries in the center, cavalry on both wings, and light infantry out front. Crassus held the center. His son Publius commanded the right flank. It looked like the textbook layout of Rome's finest war machine. But Surena had rewritten the playbook. The Parthians arrived with no infantry at all, just cavalry. Thousands of them. They moved as one, shifting across the desert like a school of fish, surrounding the Romans and keeping just enough distance to remain untouchable. Then came the arrows. The sky darkened. Wave after wave of arrows rained down on the Roman ranks. Normally, enemies would run out of ammunition quickly, but not this time. The Parthians had camel caravans following them, loaded with extra arrows. The barrage never stopped. Roman shields weren't made to deal with this kind of sustained, long-range assault. Soldiers dropped dead or wounded by the dozens. Morale broke down. Hours passed. Crassus hesitated, unsure what to do. That's when Publius made a fatal move. Hungry for glory and desperate to relieve pressure on the main army, he led his cavalry in a bold charge straight at the Parthian center. It was exactly what Surena had hoped for. The heavily armored cataphracts absorbed the Roman charge like a wall of steel. Then, like water closing in, the horse archers encircled Publius's force, raining arrows from every direction. There was no escape. Cut off, surrounded, and under constant fire, Publius and his men were slaughtered in full view of the Roman main line. Crassus watched, helpless, as his son was killed, and that moment changed everything. The brutal events at Carrhae weren't just a military failure. They became the cautionary tale of an empire. Crassus, once hailed as the richest man in Rome, had turned his hunger for gold into a fatal obsession. And now, with his army shattered and his son slaughtered, the man who thought he could buy glory was left clinging to the hope of diplomacy. After the initial chaos, Crassus limped into the city of Carrhae with a shattered force. Over 20,000 Roman soldiers had perished in a single day. Another 10,000 were captured. Only a few thousand managed to retreat to relative safety behind the city's walls. The invincible Roman legions, symbols of discipline, structure, and engineering, had been outmaneuvered by horse archers and heavy cavalry in a vast desert they didn't understand. Carrhae offered no real refuge. Supplies were dwindling, morale was non-existent, and Crassus himself was barely functioning. Those who had once followed him with confidence now saw only a man unraveling under the weight of grief and humiliation. The soldiers who had fought under him no longer viewed him as a leader, but as the architect of their disaster. And then came Surena's offer, a ceasefire, an invitation to parley, a chance, however slim, to negotiate terms of Roman withdrawal. It must have seemed like a lifeline. Surena, the Parthian general who had orchestrated the devastating victory, proposed a peaceful resolution. Rome would be allowed to withdraw, under conditions, of course. Crassus, in his desperation to salvage anything from this catastrophe, agreed. His officers begged him to reconsider. They smelled a trap. But Crassus couldn't see another way. He needed something, anything, to bring back to Rome beyond shame and the ashes of his legacy. So under a white flag, he and a small group of advisors met with the Parthians on neutral ground. What happened next is still debated. Some say a scuffle broke out over the interpretation of terms. Others claim it was premeditated treachery. One Roman source even suggests the Parthians tricked Crassus into lowering his guard before suddenly overwhelming his escort. Regardless of the details, one truth remained. Crassus never returned from that meeting. Captured and humiliated, he now stood face to face with Surena, the brilliant mind behind the Parthian victory. But this wasn't a man simply out for vengeance. Surena understood the power of symbols. He wasn't just dealing with a Roman general. He was dealing with the Marcus Licinius Crassus, the tycoon who had shaped Roman politics through money and manipulation, the man who had come east seeking not justice, not peace, but plunder. Surena wanted to send a message, and so the punishment was designed not just to kill, but to define Crassus, to turn him into a symbol, a warning, a spectacle. Gold, molten, scalding, deadly, was prepared. The same gold that Crassus had chased across continents. The same gold that had bought his villas, his influence, his illusions of power. Now it would become his executioner. In front of a grim audience, Parthian nobles, soldiers, and captured Romans, Crassus was forced to kneel. His mouth was pried open. No last speech. No plea for mercy. Just a slow, agonizing stream of molten gold poured directly into his throat. His insides seared, his body convulsed, and in a grotesque, symbolic death, Rome's richest man was silenced by the very thing he worshipped. It was cruel. It was theatrical. But it was effective. Surena had transformed a battlefield victory into a cultural and psychological triumph. He didn't just defeat a Roman army. He struck at the heart of Roman arrogance. Word of Crassus's death, and the horrific way it happened, spread fast. Within weeks, the tale had reached Rome, where senators and generals recoiled in horror. The idea that a Roman commander could be killed, mocked, and mutilated in such a public way shattered the illusion of Rome's invincibility. Even more disturbing was how the Parthians used his death. Crassus's severed head was allegedly sent to the Parthian capital as a gruesome trophy. There it played a starring role in one of the most surreal acts of political theater the ancient world had ever seen. According to historical accounts, his head was used as a stage prop in a Parthian performance of the Bacchae. a Greek tragedy by Euripides. In the play, a king who defies the gods is torn apart, his head displayed as a warning. The symbolism was clear. Crassus, like the doomed king in the play, had dared to overreach. He had defied the natural order. And now he was a cautionary tale. His ambition laid bare, literally, for public amusement. It was mockery on a grand scale. But even more haunting than Crassus's death was what followed. Rome didn't retaliate immediately. Instead, it recoiled. The eastern frontier, once seen as a realm of opportunity and riches, now looked like a graveyard. No Roman army would dare challenge Parthia again for nearly 30 years. The political fallout back in Rome was massive. Crassus had been the third pillar of the first triumvirate. With him gone, the uneasy balance between Pompey and Caesar crumbled. There was no one left to keep their rivalry in check. Civil war loomed on the horizon, a storm Crassus himself had hoped to prevent by securing glory and wealth abroad. In trying to preserve Rome's power structure, he had helped dismantle it. The disaster at Carrhae echoed through Roman history for generations. Military manuals were rewritten, training regimens changed. No longer would Rome underestimate the power of horse archers, of mobility, or of terrain unfamiliar to European soldiers. But more than military lessons, Rome absorbed a deeper message, one of caution. The Parthians had demonstrated something that no one else had before: psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. They understood how to craft an image that would endure. Crassus's golden death became more than a footnote. It became myth. Surviving Roman soldiers who were taken prisoner were treated very differently. Many were settled in Parthian territory and allowed to live, work, and even start families. These former soldiers, living reminders of Roman defeat, were used not as slaves, but as warnings. They were walking proof that Parthia was not a backwater, not an easy mark, but a power to be respected. As time passed, Crassus's death was retold again and again in Roman literature, art, and moral philosophy. Plutarch would later describe it not just as punishment, but as poetic justice. The greedy man consumed by gold. A literalization of the metaphor that still resonates today. But was it all true? Some modern historians doubt the molten gold story. They suggest it might have been exaggeration, propaganda turned into legend. Maybe the execution wasn't quite so theatrical. Maybe the gold wasn't poured, but symbolic. Maybe Crassus simply died a prisoner, humiliated but not tormented. Still, the truth of the tale doesn't lie in its literal accuracy, but in what it came to represent. Crassus's death marked the boundary between ambition and madness, between conquest and catastrophe, between a man who could have ruled the world and one who tried to take too much from it. The molten gold wasn't just punishment, it was parable. Marcus Licinius Crassus, once a titan of Roman finance, had become a cautionary tale told in every forum, every barracks, every back alley of the Republic. And whether the gold melted in his throat was real or metaphor, it didn't matter. The world believed it. And belief in history is power. In the decades that followed, Rome would recover militarily. They always did. But politically, socially, even spiritually, the death of Crassus left a scar. It signaled the end of the Roman dream that money could buy anything, that the East could be plundered without consequence. That ambition, unchecked by wisdom, was anything other than suicide with better branding. What Crassus had underestimated, fatally, was that not every enemy fights for profit. The Parthians didn't need to conquer Rome. They just needed to remind it that it could bleed, that its legions were not invulnerable. that its generals were not gods. And this, the psychological toll, was a wound that wouldn't close. The Parthians, for their part, elevated Surena to almost mythical status. He had defended the empire with brilliance and style, making a mockery of Roman arrogance. But even his triumph would be short-lived. Surena, despite his genius, was executed by the Parthian king not long after the battle, likely out of jealousy, fear, or both. That's the brutal irony of history. Even heroes aren't safe from the shadows of the empires they serve. Back in Rome, Crassus's family tried to rehabilitate his name. Statues were commissioned, honors invented, but the stain of Carrhae wouldn't wash off. His peers remembered him not for his earlier triumphs, but for the day he led 7 legions into a desert and left them to die in the sand. His defeat became part of Roman education. The example whispered to young commanders, "Don't be like Crassus. Don't let pride blind you. Don't chase shadows across foreign horizons for glory you don't understand." In the centuries that followed, molten gold would return as a motif in art, in literature, in political satire. The image of a man gagging on the thing he loved most became irresistible, too rich in irony to abandon. Shakespeare would echo it. Renaissance painters would depict it. Even modern economists invoke Crassus when they talk about the danger of markets without morality. His death, exaggerated or not, has become one of the most enduring moral stories in Western history. And in that story is a warning that still applies. Wealth can open doors, but it can also blind. Ambition can build nations, but it can also bury them. And if you drink too deeply from the chalice of power, you may find, like Crassus, that it's not wine inside, but molten gold. This has been Blended Histories. If this story gripped you, disturbed you, or made you see empire in a darker light, subscribe for more tales the textbooks don't want to dwell on. Because behind every statue, every battle, and every triumph, there's a shadow. Next time, the forgotten children of Sparta, how cruelty made them legends, and silence buried their truth.